Hola, hermano Lamanita, he says every time I see him at our ward, and I'm like, yeah, whatever, dude. So was the story Carlos told me one afternoon. Carlos is a friend. He's not so much a research participant as he's a research ally, someone I turn to with questions or just to talk and discuss pressing LDS topics. I've known Carlos and his family for several years, as long as I've been collecting Latinx LDS narratives. Our children play together, and he often reminds me of what little I actually know about the LDS experience. On this occasion, Carlos was relating the very mixed feelings some folks have to being tied to the Lamanite label. For some Latinx, like the man who greets Carlos, this Lamanite label is a point of pride and community. For others, like Carlos, a US born and raised Latino male, it's a condescending reminder of being set apart, or rather set aside, as not fully Mormon or worthy of leadership. One need only look to the general authorities listings to see how representation matters and structural leadership is determined. Individuals like Carlos and several others have pointed to me, for instance, how often Spanish surname general authority are always tend to be from Latin America, not the US, and are always professional and well-educated men. Where does this leave the working class family, the immigrant family, the US Latinx family who struggles every day and still remains committed to their faith? Are Latinx LDS members without college educations unworthy of higher callings? And what of undocumented LDS? Are they to be structurally denied a place both in their church and the society they live in? I should explain first what the X means in the term Latinx Lamanites or Lamanitas. Latinx is a gender-neutral way to speak about both men and women and LGBT populations. In my work, I have spoken to folks across the gender spectrum, and though members of the church still conform to traditional gender roles, I wanted the title of this talk at least to account for the LDS Spanish-speaking members, inclusive of all genders and sexualities. I will use Latino going forward in this paper because the LDS world is not necessarily gender-neutral space. So my work on LDS Latinos, their agency and their sense of spiritual and personal autonomy, perhaps most importantly, my continuing research unearths the narratives of Latino saints themselves to understand what their church means to them. In part, this includes an exploration of the doctrine to explore how Spanish-speaking members appropriate or distance themselves from laymen. Additionally, I also make use of intersectional theory, as you see here, to understand how the Latinx community is raced, gendered, and classed simultaneously in their experiences with religion. More recently, I have also begun to interview the next generation of LDS Latino millennials and how they carry their faith forward or grow frustrated by the lack of adequate response to larger social justice issues like immigration, gender, and race politics. So my first introduction to Latino Mormons was a small branch in Indiana in 2006, and just a little shameless plug if you want to read about that. My book, Latino Heartland's been out for a couple of years. And in this moment, as an ethnographer, I sat through sacrament meetings, attended Sociedad de Socorro, Relief Society, and Mujeres Jóvenes, Young Women's, went to weekend events and outings, and interviewed members of this branch on their experiences. Now, the book is not entirely about the Mormon experience. It just is about Latinos in the Midwest, in Indiana. And there's a section on there specifically on Latina women where I talk about the relationship to each other. At present, I continue to conduct ethnography, participant observation, archival analysis, and oral history interviews with Mormon Latina communities in Arizona and Salt Lake City. So if I can summarize my research outcomes thus far, and this has been a common theme, I think, this weekend, it is that Latino LDS members are not a monolith. There are a variety of nationalities and even languages spoken within a ward. Some come to Mormonism as adults, others are born into it. In the US, there are international students, refugees, undocumented immigrants, permanent residents, citizens, and even mixed status families. And if you want to know about that more, just let me know and I'll define that later. But all in one Spanish-speaking ward. There are some LDS Latinos who rejoice in the blending of their ethnicity with their faith, and here's some images of that. And others who utilize assimilation to move up the social ladder. There are Republicans and Democrats, and even some progressive socialists. I have met Latinos who would serve in the first presidency tomorrow if asked or called, and those who have left the church because they were critical of what they felt was a white supremacist undertone. Just in the 35 interviews that I've done so far and various informal conversations, I've come to know the complexity of the Latino LDS experience. This presentation reveals what brought me to this work in the first place, immigration policy. I use this moment in LDS immigration policy to explore the Lamanite narrative further and reasons why someone like Carlos, from the beginning, might hesitate fully with that label. So let's begin with Mesa, Arizona. Mesa is a town that for 11 years, LDS member Russell Pierce represented. Labeled the most conservative city in the country in 2017 by the Pew Research Center, a drive through Mesa reveals taquerias and trucks thumping with banda music, driving alongside retirees with "Don't Tread on Me" bumper stickers. These worlds collided in 2010 when Russell Pierce introduced SB 1070. Wards were divided by the immigration debate. Politics were supposed to be off the table during sacrament meeting, but one could feel the tension. As Josefina mentioned, quote, "My husband knew he shouldn't, but he snuck in the importance of getting along and acceptance during one of the sacrament meetings." Years after 1070, LDS members still recalled the anger and despair caused by ese Pierce y Payo. Elder Ted, an older white LDS member, lamented, "We lost a lot of leadership then. It was a huge blow to our community. People left, they fled in fear for their families." Caught between conservative members like Pierce, who was Mormon himself, and the undeniable growth of the LDS Latino population, Salt Lake City finally responded to Pierce's suggestions that the church supported his hardline stance against undocumented immigrants. Over a year, let me turn this other picture. Over a year after the bill was signed into law, the LDS Church released the following statement. "The history of mass expulsion or mistreatment of individuals or families is cause for concern, especially where race, culture, or religion are involved. This should give pause to any policy that contemplates targeting any one group, particularly if that group comes mostly from one heritage." And here you see the image. This is on the Mesa Temple, right, from 1918. They kind of had already hearkened to a tie between Mormon pioneers, and I would argue this bottom is Mexican saints, right? This was 1918 when the temple was built. This church statement promoted a more compassionate approach toward immigration and suggested some unique parallels with history of fleeing that defines an LDS past. Progressive LDS members who eventually recalled and voted Russell Pierce out of office advocated for a church united, a family of sorts that defended siblings from hateful politics. Using the family as a model for understanding the church is valuable for multiple reasons, not the least of which is the church's emphasis on the family as a unifying theme for faith. For instance, the Book of Mormon includes a common family dynamic of sibling rivalry. Unwilling to respect the teachings of their little brother, Nephi, Laman and Lemuel continuously question, defy, and even plot to kill their prophetic little brother. As once lost and then found, descendants of Laman can be seen as prodigal sons and daughters welcomed back into God's glory. By accepting the teachings of the LDS Church, descendants of Laman could return to being pure and delightsome and restore the knowledge of their fathers, Nephi 30. Perceiving indigenous and Spanish-speaking peoples as once impure and unpleasant is certainly problematic. But for some, this passage signals the exalted nature of those who, using Plato's allegory of the cave, unchained themselves to see the true living world. LDS Bishop and University of Utah professor Dr. Orlando Rivera placed this Lamanite narrative centrally within Chicano nationalism in 1978. His essay says, "We are ourselves Chicanos, and all Chicanos think of themselves as having an Indo-Hispanic background, of having ancestral roots native to America as well as to Europe. Thus, you considering us Lamanites is in no way offensive, but rather acceptable to our people. We are proud of our Native American progenitors." Rivera suggests that highlighting ties to Lamanite identity makes sense for a Chicano community rooted in indigenous heritage. He goes on to inform his Mormon audience about the internal colonialism model, to describe the exploitive relationship between Anglos and Latinos in the United States. Here, internal colonialism is meant to reference the internal racial domination of one group within a nation and the subsequent oppression of other groups by, in this case, English-speaking Anglo or white-identified individuals. Rivera suggests that Mormons can be the process of healing, to heal this internal colonial model. But in order to do so, they must be cognizant of the barriers, the quote, barriers that inhibit such a bridging, end quote. Barriers such as the subtle and overt racial linguistic supremacy that justified a racial privilege to the priesthood. Remember, that's 1978, so there was different policies enacted, if you recall. More specifically, Rivera critiqued the closure of Spanish-speaking wards by leaders who viewed assimilation as the only avenue for acceptance. Following this clear framing with Chicano nationalism, Rivera asserts the need for self-determination amongst the growing Latino LDS communities. Quote, "We must have an opportunity to plan for and administer and do things in our own way, for our own selves, completely and independently." This is in 1978. For Rivera, pride in indigenous Lamanite heritage meant also claiming autonomous agency from English-dominant LDS leadership. Not being able to plan or administer themselves was parallel to imperial rule, an idea that Mormons in Mexico had protested back in 1936 when they asserted autonomy in the Third Convention. Present-day LDS Latinos have a complex relationship with the Lamanite identity. When I interviewed Latinos about a Lamanite connection, there are varied responses, from outright laughter of, "Remember when they used to call us Lamanites?" And the laughter, to more positive assertions of, "It is our history. It is us, our story, our people. It's meaningful. It's our history." However, returning to Carlos from the beginning, he explained that when the church stopped referring to Lamanites, quote, "they didn't even ask the Lamanites themselves if they wanted to de-emphasize the story." Though Carlos does not see himself as Lamanite, he does find it curious that members who were proud of that label were summarily ignored once headquarters decided it was time to move on. Unlike Professor Rivera, this generation of LDS members have a much harder time with the Lamanite label. As Nelda McAllister wrote in an essay in LDS Living, "I don't know of many other things that drive LDS Latinos crazier than well-meaning persons confusing their identity by saying things like, 'You are surely from the tribe of Manasseh, since you are Mexican, right?' Hispanic people are fiercely proud of their heritage and culture, but they are also pigeonholed quite a few times." For both Nelda and Carlos, the issue is not affiliation with indigeneity. Their issue is the condescending tone that often accompanies associations with Manasseh or layman. It is as if the descendants of little brother Nephi are still holding something over the descendants of Laman, and additionally asserting a neocolonial responsibility or burden to control them. Being identified as Lamanites and part of the tribe of Manasseh, Latinos might feel they are being imagined as something other than mainstream LDS, and as descendants of Laman might be subconsciously viewed through a history of violence, rebellion, or worse, as novices to the faith. Indeed, though I have heard from many white LDS members that they say they appreciate the culture and the commitment to family that Latinos exhibit, it is rare to hear about the intellect, the leadership, the scriptural knowledge of their Spanish-speaking brethren. So rare that I've not heard it ever. As a non-member, I constantly face moments of explaining my approach with the research, my interests, and most importantly, my willingness to hear their voices rather than condemn or fetishize them. I want to highlight how they experience their faith. Sometimes this means complete affiliation, and sometimes this means withdrawal from the church. My work is all about listening and understanding without judgment. That means being attentive and emphasizing with DACA students when they share tears of anger and frustration with right-leaning Mormon leadership. But this also means sitting across from a Spanish-speaking bishop and his wife as they speak of their many callings and blessings as a result of the gospel. The story or stories of LDS Latinos are complicated. There are tales of dissatisfaction, resiliency, and inspiration. Lamanite or not, US Latinx LDS members need to be more fully listened to and accounted for what they bring to the wider spectrum of LDS experiences. That means recognizing them beyond their enchilada platters. Thank you.